Revelation 20. Then I saw a messenger coming down out of heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. He seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the slanderer, and Satan the accuser, and he bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he could no longer deceive the nations until the 1,000 years were finished. After these things he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and those who sat upon them were given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Iesus and for the word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark upon their forehead or upon their hand. They came to life and reigned with the Anointed for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a share in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no authority. Rather, they will be priests of God and of the Anointed, and they will reign with him for the 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are finished, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will go out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for the war. Their number is like the sand of the sea. They came up over the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the holy ones and the beloved city. But fire came down out of heaven and consumed them. And the slanderer who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are also. And they will be tormented day and night into the ages of the ages. Then I saw a great white throne, and the one seated upon it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of the things written in the books, according to their works. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and each was judged according to his works. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if any one was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Notes on the text. These notes follow the chapter in order. They stay with what the Greek says and where its images come from. At several points, the language genuinely allows more than one rendering. There, both options are set out, so the choice can be made on contextual grounds or left open. And where the text settles a matter, no false choice is offered. Where the chapter says less than readers often want, that silence is marked rather than filled. The abyss, the key, the seal, and the chain. Verses 1-3. The abyss is abyssos, literally bottomless, without depth. In the Greek Old Testament, it renders tehom, the primordial deep of Genesis 1-2. The watery chaos that God restrains. By the 1st century, it had become the holding place of bound spirits and of the dead, the opposite of heaven. In this chapter, the abyss is a sealed prison, not a final destination. The dragon is cast into the abyss in verse 3, but into the lake of fire in verse 10. The abyss is custody. The lake of fire is sentence. The text keeps the two distinct, and that distinction carries the structure of the chapter. The messenger holds the key of the abyss. A key is authority to open and to shut, and the book has already located that authority in the Anointed, who holds the keys of death and of Hades in chapter 1, verse 18. The messenger therefore acts on delegated authority, not his own. The sealing, shut it and sealed it over him, is the language of secure custody. A seal guarantees that what is shut stays shut untampered, until the appointed time. The chain, halalysis, is great, megale, a physical image for the restraint of something otherwise uncontainable, and the reversal is the point. The one who held the nations in deception is himself bound. The chapter gives these images and lets their weight be felt. It does not describe the appearance of the abyss, the composition of the chain, or the mechanism of the binding. Those are silences left open on purpose, and reading physical detail into them goes past what the text says. The 1,000 years, verses 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The phrase is chilia ete, 1,000 years. The Greek carries no marker telling the reader whether the figure is a literal count of solar years or a symbolic span, and Revelation everywhere else uses its numbers symbolically: 7, 12, the squared and cubed thousands of the holy city. The number itself is silent. Only the wider reading of the book can guide it. Chapter 20 needs a more careful walkthrough, and I have taken the liberty of providing it. Reading A, symbolic span. He bound him for the long age, where the 1,000 stands for a full and complete period of indefinite length, the present era between the decisive binding of the strong man and the final loosing. This fits Revelation's consistent symbolic use of numbers and the language of Iesu about binding the strong man before plundering his house. Reading B, the figure left standing is given. He bound him for 1,000 years, rendering the number as the text gives it and leaving the reader to weigh its length. This is the more transparent rendering of the words on the page and does not foreclose the symbolic sense. It simply declines to interpret within the translation. The narrative above uses reading B, which keeps the translation transparent and leaves the interpretive weight to the reader. Reading A may be preferred where the surrounding teaching has already established the symbolic frame. What the 1,000 years is, the era in view. Whether the number is literal or symbolic is a separate question from what the 1,000 years actually is. That is, what era it refers to and when it runs. A reader can grant that the figure is symbolic and still need to know what stretch of time is being symbolized. 3 classic positions divide the question, and the chapter permits each to be argued from the text. The first reading locates the 1,000 years in the present age, the whole stretch between the first and second comings of Christ. On this view, the binding of Satan is the restraint accomplished at the cross and resurrection, so that he can no longer hold the nations in total darkness, which fits the purpose clause of verse 3 exactly. And the reign of the holy ones is the present reign of the faithful with the Anointed One. The first resurrection is then a coming to life of another kind, rather than a bodily rising, and the consummation of verses 11 to 15 follows at the end of this age. The return of Christ comes after the 1,000 years. The second rendering also places the 1,000 years in the present age, but understands it as an era of advancing or triumphant gospel witness, in which the binding allows the nations to be reached and the reign of the Anointed One visibly progresses through his people before he returns. This shares the already location of the first reading, but expects more visible fruit in history. Here, too, the return comes after the 1,000 years. A third opinion, gathered under the name premillennialism, takes the 1,000 years as a future and earthly reign of Christ following his return, a distinct age set between his coming and the final judgment. For this position, the binding is a still future event. The first resurrection is the bodily raising of the holy ones at his coming, and the judgment at the great white throne follows the close of the 1,000 years. The return, therefore, comes before the 1,000 years, which is what the name intends. It is worth marking carefully what this view does and does not require, since it is often confused with dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is only one branch of the premillennial family, and it adds its own architecture, a standing separation between Israel and the Church. a kingdom still owed to national Israel, and, in most forms, a removal of the church before a final tribulation. The older premillennial reading, held by some in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, carries none of that apparatus. It affirms the future reign while reading one undivided people of God. To describe the third position, then, is not to describe dispensationalism, and it is certainly not to assume it. Within a frame that takes the destruction of Jerusalem in the 1st century as the primary referent for the body of this book, the natural fit is one of the present age readings, and the rendering here takes the 1,000 years as the present age, the long span already begun in the 1st century and running until the final loosing. 2 start points are defensible, and the text permits either. The first anchors the binding in the victory of the cross and resurrection, where the strong man is bound before his house is plundered. The words of Iesus in Matthew 12:29. The ruler of this age is cast out, John 12:31. And the powers are disarmed, Colossians 2:15. The second anchors it in the judgment that fell as the Old Covenant order passed, so that the millennial age opens as that system ends and the gospel goes to the nations unhindered, which keeps the hinge of the chapter consistent with the primary referent of the rest of the book. Either way, the structure is the same. The 1st century is the primary referent for the body of the book, while the final loosing, the gathering of Gog and Magog, and the great white throne are the genuinely future consummation. And the 1,000 years is the long already stretch in between. The honest tension this understanding produces is that of another question. If the binding means Satan cannot deceive the nations, and yet deception plainly continues in the present age, then the binding has to be a specific restraint rather than a total cessation. The nations as a whole are no longer kept in the darkness they were in before. A church triumphant should be the song of believers. The strongest point of the future reign understanding is here, that present evil seems too active for Satan to be bound in any ordinary sense, which presses the binding toward the future. That counter deserves to be stated plainly rather than waved aside, and the next section takes it up directly. So that he could no longer deceive the nations. Verse 3. The purpose clause is hina me planese, so that he might not deceive. The verb planao means to lead astray. The binding is defined by its effect, a restraint upon the deceiving of the ethne, the nations. The Greek does not describe a total cessation of all activity, but a specific restraint, that the nations are no longer kept in the dark as they once were. The text permits a binding that is real and decisive without being absolute. The thrones, and judgment was given, verse 4. The thrones are plural, and those seated are given krima, judgment. The phrase krima edothai autois can be heard 2 ways, both legitimate. The right to judge was granted to them, or the verdict was rendered in their favor, that is, vindication. The Greek does not force the choice. The identity of those seated is also left unspecified in the verse itself. The clause that follows names the souls of those beheaded, which is why many tie the thrones to the martyrs. But the text moves from thrones to souls without spelling out the relation. The governing background is the throne scene of Daniel chapter 7, where thrones were set and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, verses 9 and 22. They came to life, and the first resurrection, verses 5, 6. The verb is izaisan, from zao, to live, and is translated, they came to life. It appears again in verse 5 in reference to the rest of the dead. First resurrection is anastasis hai protai. The whole question rests on whether izaisan and anastasis here mean a bodily rising or a coming to life of another kind. And since both senses occur in the New Testament, the words cannot settle it alone. Looking at alternative understandings, a coming to life of another kind could mean Ezeesan and Anastasis he prote describe something other than a bodily rising. The New Testament does use resurrection language for present spiritual life, most plainly in John 5:24-25, where the dead hear the voice of the Son of God, and now is, and live. And in Ephesians 2:5-6, where God made us alive together with the Anointed One, and raised us up together. So the category itself, life language used of something other than the body coming out of the grave, is firmly biblical. Within this rendering, two distinct versions must be separated, because each must be evaluated on its own merits. Rendering of regeneration, the new birth. The first resurrection is conversion, the passing from death to life now, with Ezeesan describing the soul made alive in Christ. The bodily raising of all at the end is then the only resurrection still future. The strength of this is John 5:24-25, which describes exactly such a present coming to life of the spiritually dead and uses the same life language. Its difficulty lies in the local context. The ones who came to life are named as the souls of those who had been beheaded, kas sikas ton pepelekismenon, that is, believers already dead for the faith, not living sinners being converted. And in verse 5, the same verb governs the rest of the dead, who did not Ezeesan until the 1,000 years were finished. If Ezeesan means were born again, in verse 4, then verse 5 would read, the rest of the dead were not born again until the 1,000 years were over. That is difficult to reconcile with John's use of the same verb in the same context across both verses. Rendering of, vindication and reign of the departed faithful. The first resurrection is the entry of the faithful into life at or after their death, their coming to life and reigning with Christ, distinguished from the bodily resurrection of all the dead at the throne in verses 11-15. The subject named is psyche, souls, and on this reading that fits. These are the dead who pass into life on the far side of death. This is the textual difficulty that the regeneration view must explain. The subjects really are dead people. Ezeesan can carry the same sense in both verses, one group entering life at death and the other not until later. And this is the first resurrection points at a coming to life rather than at an earthly conversion. The declaration that the second death has no power over such completes the picture. The believer dies once in the body, yet the second death holds no claim upon him. He knows a first coming to life in the present age and a bodily resurrection at the end. The unbeliever experiences no such first resurrection. Though raised at the end as well, he is raised only to encounter the second death. Rendering of, bodily rising of the martyrs. They came back to life, taking Ezeesan in its plainest physical sense, a bodily resurrection of the martyrs specifically, set apart from and prior to the general resurrection. This reading has a significant strength. It allows anastasis to carry its normal meaning and treats the parallel with verse 5 consistently, where the same verb plainly concerns the dead returning to life. Its weakness lies elsewhere. It requires two bodily resurrections separated by the 1,000 years, a sequence the rest of the New Testament does not clearly present. The narrative above renders the verbs plainly. They came to life without resolving the question. Among the non-bodily interpretations, the context favors one understanding over the other. The subjects are already dead martyrs, and the shared verb in verse 5 ties the two comings to life together in a way conversion does not fit. The regeneration interpretation is not thereby absurd, since one author can hold present and future resurrection close together, as John does in chapter 5, verses 25 and 28 to 29. It simply faces a harder time with the dead martyr subject in this particular text. The decisive contextual clue across all interpretations is the connection between the first resurrection and the second death. Whatever view is adopted must make sense of that correspondence. For that reason, the rendering preserves the language of the text and allows the reader to weigh the pattern for himself. Gog and Magog, verses 7, 8. The names Gog and Magog are drawn from Ezekiel, where they name a northern coalition gathered against the restored people. Here they function not as a single nation, but as a label for the nations at the four corners of the earth. The deceived peoples from every quarter gathered for a final assault. The Greek treats them as representative rather than geographic. The four corners signal totality, not a compass heading. This final gathering stands after the 1,000 years and is structurally distinct from the coalition of Ezekiel and from the earlier judgments in the book. It is the last rebellion before the throne is set. The camp, the beloved city, and the war that never happens. Verses 8, 9. The nations gather for the war, ton polemon. John does not speak of a war, but of the war, the final confrontation toward which the visions have been moving. Then there is no war. They surround the camp of the holy ones and the beloved city, fusing two Old Testament pictures. Camp, parembole, evokes Israel encamped in the wilderness, the tribes arrayed around the tabernacle in Numbers chapter 2. The beloved city is Jerusalem language, the city God loves, as in Psalm 78:68 and Psalm 87:2. The deceived nations take the posture of a siege, yet the deliverance comes not by battle, but by fire from heaven. The verb katephagen, devoured, is the picture of consuming fire used across the Old Testament, the language of Sodom in Genesis 19:24, and of Elijah in 2 Kings chapter 1. No clash is described. The fire ends it before it begins. The anticlimax is deliberate, and the reader is meant to hear that the final assault ends the way divine judgment often ends throughout the Old Testament, from above, not by the sword. The great white throne and the dead. Verses 11, 12, 13. The great and the small. A figure that names two extremes in order to include everything between them, like young and old, or from least to greatest. It recurs through the book in chapter 11, verse 18, chapter 13, verse 16, and chapter 19, verses 5 and 18. The point is that no one is left out. High rank does not exempt anyone, and no one is too lowly to be seen. Three holding places then give up the dead, the sea, death, and Hades. And the point is comprehensiveness. No location of the dead is exempt, not even the sea, which to the ancient mind was the least recoverable place to be lost. Here Hades is the realm of the dead, the Greek Old Testament's standard rendering of Sheol, not a place of torment as such. This is why it can be emptied and then itself thrown into the lake of fire in verse 14, the text's way of saying the last enemy is itself destroyed, which lines up with Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:26. The books and the book of life, verse 12. Two things are opened. Books, biblia, plural, out of which the dead are judged according to their works, kata ta erga, and another book, singular, which is the book of life, to biblion tais zoes. The Greek puts the two side by side on purpose. People are judged by the record of what they did. People are saved by whether their name is in the book of life. The weight of verse 15 falls on the book of life as the deciding register. The image of opened heavenly books comes straight from Daniel 7:10. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. Behind it lie the book of remembrance in Malachi 3:16 and Moses' appeal in Exodus 32:32. The second death and the lake of fire. Verses 6-14. The second death, ho deuteros thanatos, is defined by the text itself in verse 14 as the lake of fire. The definition is given inside the passage, so no interpretive choice is required. Whatever the lake of fire is, that is what the second death is. The phrase into the ages of the ages, es tous aionas ton aionon, is the strongest expression of duration the language possesses, what English renders forever and ever. The anchor. Daniel, chapter 7. One Old Testament chapter stands behind a remarkable amount of this one. In Daniel chapter 7, thrones were set, verse 9. The judgment was set, and the books were opened, verse 10. And judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, verse 22. The thrones of verse 4, the opened books of verse 12, and the granting of judgment all draw on that single scene. For a reader who wants one cross-reference to hold the whole chapter together, Daniel 7 is that reference, and reading the two side by side shows how much of the imagery here is inherited rather than new. On the chapter as a whole, step back from the readings and weigh what the chapter says no matter which position you take. Satan is bound, and he is bound on borrowed terms. A chain he did not choose, a seal he cannot break, a release he does not schedule. The thrones are filled, the books are opened, and the ones the beast killed are the ones who reign. The reversal is total. The accuser who prosecuted the saints is shut up. The martyrs he silenced are seated. And when the last rebellion gathers, wide as the four corners of the earth, no battle is narrated. Fire falls, and it is finished. The outcome was never in doubt, because the throne was never in dispute. Then the oldest enemies of all are cleared away. Death and Hades, the grave and its keeper, are themselves thrown into the lake of fire, and the second death swallows the first. What remains is a single open book and a single question of great importance. Is your name written in it? The chapter does not settle every question readers bring to it. It settles the one that matters. Whatever else the 1,000 years may be, the judgment belongs to God, the reign belongs to his saints, and the book belongs to the Lamb. Be certain your name is in it.